So welcome to IEP Basics. This is truly designed to be the minimum necessary to know in order to be an effective voice for your child's needs, and to work collaboratively with school districts toward that end. So today, the roadmap kind of for where we're going during this training is we do a brief overview of federal laws as they apply to students with disabilities. We will then, and I think Joe, next slide. There we go. And we will then look at the key requirements of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We will talk about the paths to special education. We'll kind of take a break and do a very practical piece of what is an IEP meeting and what does it look like. We'll talk then about your very, very first IEP meeting, and that will be to look at eligibility. It's always the first thing that any family gets to experience, and it's probably one of the most complicated IEP topics that we can address. So we want to make sure that we demystify that. Then we're going to look at how educational evaluations both determine eligibility, but also tell us where we're going with this IEP. We're going to talk about the IEP process. And then we're going to talk about your options when it's time to sign the IEP. And then we'll quickly review some resources that are available to you and get right to Q&A. So it's ambitious, but totally doable. And so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and start with federal laws, and we're actually going to start talking about something called Every Student Succeeds Act. And this is a replacement for something you might have heard about, which was No Child Left Behind, or NCLB. Next slide, Joe. And so if you will kind of play with my graphic here, the yellow box simply shows it's a representation of a school campus. And if you look, it applies to all the youngsters that attend that school campus. It includes, the reason why it applies to students with disabilities is that it includes protections for high needs students, which some of our students count as high needs. It allows for preparation for college and career, which is a significant piece of an IEP as a student turns 16. It increased investment in preschool, which, as we know, is a huge piece of early intervention. It maintained statewide assessments, and it has some transparency and accountability provisions. And so we're going to go to the next slide and look at something called ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, 1990. So we just celebrated a couple years ago the 30th anniversary. That's a pretty short time, at least to somebody like me with a lot of gray hair. So ADA and the next slide are both really very similar protections. And we can generally, though, credit ADA for basic accessibility. And going back one slide, sorry, Joe, you think about ramps, you think about elevators, like the little up and down on the side. You think about disabled or accessible placard spots. You think about bathrooms that are accessible. You think about doors that open. Those are all features of ADA. And then if we move along to the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, you'll see in this slide, again, we're still on the school. All the previous things still are in place. However, I wanted to make a couple distinctions. One is that this particular protection applies to not just the students that attend the school, although that will certainly be our focus, but I want to remind you that it also applies for employees, that they who require reasonable accommodations in order to do their job are afforded them. And so I give a couple of examples. A teacher, if they need to be able to sit for portions of their day, there's a teacher sitting. But it also includes accommodations for students who have a recognized or an affirmed disability. And the other thing that this law covers, and we're not going to spend a lot of time in this particular training, but I do like to highlight it, is this covers discrimination, including issues like bullying and harassment. And so, not to introduce negative topics early, but things to keep in mind. Now we're going to scroll ahead to our primary purpose today, and that is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. 2004 was its update. And you see that there's one student in my magic door. And the reason there's one student is to highlight that this is very individualized. Those other laws really cover classes of people. This is talking about services, goals, in-depth assessment, and we're talking about relatively a very small number of students. You see the bus is kind of there to represent like access. Now we're not just talking about getting you up the ramp or in the door or up the steps, but really how a person gets to their educational environment can even be at issue. So we're going to move forward into what are the key requirements of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And I'm going right through this kind of placeholder slide into the first component, which is procedural safeguards. You'll often hear these referred to as parent rights. I like to remind people that it's not just the rights that you have, but you also have some responsibilities embedded. This document, the Notice of Procedural Safeguards, should be given to a family every single year, at least one time. There's a variety of other occasions that the family should be in receipt of another copy of the procedural safeguards. And one of the features of this document is that it really defines how a disagreement between the school and the family can be resolved. It should outline for you, these are your rights. These are, the things that you can do if you're not in agreement. But again, it also includes some responsibilities. This is such a dense document that we have a special training that is only to review the procedural safeguards. But suffice it to say, the IDEA, this is a significant part of the legislation. Next. The next component is non-discriminatory evaluation. So this non-discriminatory means a lot of things, but primarily it means that a student will be assessed in their primary language, their primary mode of communication. The assessment that they receive should be age appropriate, meaning that if a student is a teenager, we're considering teenage kind of skills and topics. If they're a youngster, we're assessing them like we would a youngster. We look at using tests that are not biased in favor of or against any group. So this is what we call validity, or that it's a valid assessment. And then the last feature of calling something a non-discriminatory evaluation is that it is administered and interpreted by an appropriately qualified person from the school district. The other thing that you'll sometimes hear is that we will not rely on a single test. So there's no one test that determines eligibility or determines that a student falls into a certain disability category. That too is part of this, appropriate evaluation term. Because IDEA is relatively new, again, I was born during a time when students who had significant disabilities were not allowed to attend school. So it's, within this generation, we have gotten here. And so we really want to make sure that you understand that one of the more dramatic pieces in the Education Act was that the local education agency had to serve all students. And so this concept of zero defect meant that there was no disease that's too communicable. There is no behavior that is too severe. There is no deficit that is so great that a youngster can be denied an education because they're too disabled. And that at the time was really earth-shattering. And I feel like it's appropriate to remember that it isn't that long ago, and that no matter what, there is a place for a student within public education. The next slide is about parent involvement. Now, this is different than parent rights and responsibilities. And this specifically throughout the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act gives times that the parent needs to give consent, and not just consent, but informed consent. And so the parent or guardian or holder of educational rights has to consent to assessment plans. They need to consent to the initial eligibility for special education, and we'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes. They need to consent to changes in services and placement. They need to consent if the school district proposes to exit a student from special education. And it also includes this idea that the parent and guardian are members of the team that makes decisions about the student. So this is another topic that is so big and has so many points of entry that we offer a special 1-hour training, and that training is called Meaningful Participation in Your Child's IEP and Beyond. Next slide is to introduce a concept called FAPE, and that stands for Free, Appropriate, Public Education. I'm going to just define those. Free means at no cost to the family. Appropriate means that it's been reasonably determined to offer educational benefit to the student. We're going to spend a lot of time on what that means. Public means that the public is overseeing the education, and education again means generally means that your child is going to have an individualized education program. And we're going to look at the next concept, which is LRE, or Least Restrictive Environment. This is a huge piece of the IDEA, and what it means is, in general, that the law has a preference for general education, in that it prefers that a student, to the maximum extent possible, have access to not just the curriculum being used in the general education classroom, but also that the student learns alongside his or her same-aged non-disabled peers. It also has a portion or a statement that talks about that a student really shouldn't be removed from a particular inclusive setting unless they cannot receive a satisfactory education with the addition of supplementary aids and supports, or aids and services. And so what that means is that we should be bringing services in before we start removing a student out, in most cases. Next slide is the concept of IEP, which is the Individualized Education Program. And again, that's why we're here. So we're going to get to it right now. First, we're going to just quickly review the ways that that students become assessed, because there are really three kind of pipelines toward assessment. And so that is on a special graph on the next slide, I think. Yes, thanks, Joe. And there's three ways. So first of all, if your child received California Early Start Services, that would be with the regional center usually being involved, under age 3, legally, the school is required to assess that child for eligibility for special education. And so it's supposed to be a pretty seamless process. By 2 years, 9 months, you should be hooked up with the school district preparing for an assessment. And by age 3, the school district should have met with you to make a determination as a team whether a child is eligible for special education. That's like very smooth. That's one way. Another way is something called child find activities. And this occurs when a child enters usually public school, but enters any school, Head Start, private parochial school, wherever, and a staff member is concerned. They are supposed to refer to the LEA, or local education agency, to conduct a child find activity to help determine, like, we suspect this child might have a disability, and so we need to do an assessment. It's required. So again, child find is this affirmative obligation of a school to identify students who should be offered a free appropriate public education and should be offered an IEP. So that's another way. And that can, again, happen. A child enters kindergarten, a child is in 4th grade, like whenever it can happen. The third way is pretty common also, and that is the family has concerns about a student, feels like they're not making progress, receives information from maybe a doctor, or maybe they've been, kind of watching and are just very uncomfortable. For whatever reason, a family can request a special education assessment. I always say it's best to do that in writing. However, if you request this orally to a school district employee, they are supposed to assist you in making it a written request. And it is from the date they receive that request, the district or school has 15 days to provide you with an assessment plan. The law is very unambiguous. It doesn't say if we want to do a student study team, we can put this off. It doesn't say, oh, there's standardized testing coming up, we can put it off. It doesn't say we don't agree, we can put it off. It doesn't say we can give you a prior written notice. None of those things. They are to provide you with an assessment plan. And we're going to talk specifically how that goes next. And if you want to put in the chat, please feel free if you want to tell us how your child became eligible for an IEP, or how your child is being considered for an IEP. Feel free to put that in. The choices would be California Early Start, it would be parent referral, or it would be that the school district conducted child find activities. So this next slide, we want to talk about what an assessment might include. And this is, it should consist of informal kinds of things, and it should probably include at least 1 or 2 formal kinds of things. And we really want to see the collection of information from multiple sources across multiple settings in all areas of suspected disability. So that can include parent interviews, child and student interviews, teacher interviews. And when I say interview, it could be a piece of paper that they're asking you to write your answers. It can be a phone call. It can be going and talking to them. It can occur in a variety of ways, but we still would call that kind of an interview. It would consist of observing the student in a school-like environment, and it can include natural settings as appropriate. If a student might be in a different kind of school setting, that might be a place that a school observes. If the student is primarily at home right now, sometimes they will come to the home to do an assessment, observation, I should say. There should probably be some sort of formal standardized testing, but there doesn't have to be. And in some cases, there cannot be, and that's in the STAR. In California, there's a court case, Larry P. versus Riles, and that goes all the way back to 1979, and that's where the state said that a child who is African American cannot receive standardized IQ testing, not allowed. We also talk about informal assessments, and those can be screening tools, checklists. Again, those tools are often given to families, teachers, therapists, doctors, to provide some additional information to the team. And then there's something called records review, and that can include school records, but it also can include independent or medical reports that a family would choose to provide to the assessment team. So I want to talk about that timeline. And so, like I said before, from the day that the school receives a request, whether it's coming from you or school study team, they really have that 15 days to develop a written assessment plan. That regional center, California Early Start pathway is really defined in education code. And so that doesn't quite play by the same rules, but generally speaking, They're going to give you an assessment plan. It should be reasonably detailed for you to kind of understand what areas are being looked at. Usually there's an opportunity for you to indicate if your child has had some of these assessments previously, especially within the last year. It's really important to let the school know, oh, they've had this kind of testing. Oh, they've had this, so that they don't replicate the exact testing and thus negate their testing. Because some tests you really can only give like once a year. And so this is really an opportunity to have some communication about your child's history. You have at least 15 days, although if you're the one asking them to assess, it's in your benefit to respond to that assessment, to give consent sooner rather than later, because that each day you hold on is going to push the timeline back. Within 60 calendar days of the school receiving your written consent, you can't just say, go ahead and test, you have to write and sign permission. The school must conduct the assessment and convene the IEP team to review that assessment. When we say calendar days, so that's 60 calendar days or the 15 calendar days, if the school is on a vacation of more than 5 consecutive days, we stop counting. So requesting an assessment on June 2nd it's not going to happen until we come back. Those calendar days are going to be very much interrupted. I think we can go to the next slide. And we're going to talk about IEP team meetings. We're going to kind of take a break from all the technical stuff and really do like a who, when, where, why. And obviously the what is the IEP document, which to define it, some people define it as a contract between what the school is agreeing to provide to the family. It is a contract, but it is how do I want to say? It's a contract, but enforcing the contract is sometimes difficult. So we're going to keep going. The who, an easier question. The IEP team has to have a minimum of 3 people on that team. The parent or guardian, you, a special education teacher, and what we call an administrative designee. So that's a school administrator, again, or their designee. Many, 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 many times, if a student is being considered for a general education setting or will be participating in any general education, there is a 4th required person, and that is a general education teacher. Beyond that, we want to talk about students, the student participation. Now, when a student is 3 years old, we don't expect that they're really going to derive a lot of benefit from sitting in a room where they're being talked about, and they're probably not going to participate a ton. But as a student grows, we really want to think about ways to include their voice in the IEP team, to really include their strengths, their preferences, their interests. And as they start to have their own goals, we want to make sure that that is coming into the IEP room and being considered. And as a student starts to reach adulthood, the student has to be invited. So by age 16, the student has to be on the guest list. It doesn't mean they have to attend the entire meeting, but they need to be invited. And at age 18, the vast majority of students with disabilities will be holding their own education rights and making decisions about their IEPs. When we also look at who else can participate, we want to be clear that people who have special knowledge of the student or the student's needs, that would be people like professionals who have assessed the student or people who are currently providing services to the student at school. Sometimes the district will invite, or the school will invite, other staff members who have maybe not particular knowledge about the child and his needs, but rather a lot more knowledge about district options, different placements, different policies. So sometimes you'll see someone come in who's more of a special education administrator, for example, and that's to provide that level of support mostly to the team, who might be very experienced at, writing an IEP for a certain, certain kind of service, but is less experienced about perhaps referring a student to a specialized program. That is not all. You, as the parent, completely have the right to invite a person who will benefit you. That could be a support person. Sometimes it's a spouse. Sometimes it's a dear friend. Sometimes it's a mom of another student with a disability who's been through the process. Sometimes it is an advocate or an attorney. I do want to point out, if you do invite an attorney, you do need to let the school district know, because they are allowed to bring an attorney also. If you bring one, they get to have one. And then last, but certainly not least, interpretation is a huge piece of access and having a parent be able to meaningfully participate. And I want to just emphasize that this is sufficiently complex and enough of it requires really a specialized skill set. And so we really do want a professional interpreter like we have today, Mario. We don't want to just grab someone down the hall who has no idea about what an IEP is, who doesn't know the appropriate terms, and throw them into the IEP and ask them to interpret. So if you do require interpretation, make sure that you're asking for that professional interpreter, professional special education interpreter, early and often. Next slide is the when. The big takeaway is that the IEP team should convene at a mutually agreeable date and time. Now, that doesn't mean we get to say, oh, 8:30 p.m. on Friday night. That's probably not going to be the most effective, mutually agreeable, mutually for you, but probably not for the staff. And so really setting up those kind of expectations along with your case manager, and that's usually your child's primary service provider. And they're usually the ones that are inviting people, that are communicating with you. And it's helpful to kind of talk about when you're available, when you can participate, and agreeing on a time limit in advance of the meeting, like really having really clear expectations. And then we're going to, along with when, is the where. And at this time, most schools seem to kind of yield to family preference. If you want to have an in-person meeting, they're pretty open to having an in-person meeting. If you prefer telephone, if you prefer Zoom, that is usually agreeable. A lot of times it's now kind of a hybrid. If the family wants to meet in person, okay, but there might be a team member that's located on another site that is now participating via Zoom. So again, talking to your team and letting them know what your preferences are is usually a great first step. And then the why. Why are we meeting? And I want to just kind of bring it back. The purpose of the meeting will vary depending on the kind of IEP that the team is having. But no matter what, the why, we need an agenda that helps to guide our conversation. And every single meeting should include an opportunity for introductions. It should include a reminder that you have procedural safeguards, and it should give you an opportunity to share concerns early enough in the meeting that they can influence the agenda. And again, you will receive a meeting notice telling you the when, the where, the who will be there, and the purpose of the meeting. So we're going to go back to the technical pieces. And I'm so glad you're staying with us. Educational evaluations determine eligibility. And so we're going to go through what's called a three-pronged test, but I want to just kind of preface that by saying that many of us come into special education with some sort of diagnosis from clinical settings, from a medical provider. And Joe and I, lots and lots of people call us and say, I gave them my child's diagnosis of blank and they're still making us go through an assessment. Or my child doesn't have a diagnosis and so I have to get it. These are the two kinds of calls that we're trying to make sure to kind of myth bust. The other kind of call we get is that I'm going to wait and call the school after I get an appointment with the developmental pediatrician and I'm on a wait list and it's going to be 18 months. So those are the two kinds of calls we get. For both of those calls, I want you to know the IEP team will be interested in your diagnosis from the outside, if you have one, but that they don't need it. And in fact, they consider it, but it does not substitute for them conducting an educational evaluation. So this is why that educational evaluation determines eligibility. So the first prong of the three-prong test is, does the student meet criteria that is in education code for at least one of 13 federal disability categories? And so, Joe, we can go to the next slide. These are the 13 federal eligibility categories. These are in law. I have not met someone with a disability who didn't fit into one of these with a, maybe a little shove, but these are, generally speaking, accepted. There is a 14th category called developmental delay that California does not recognize. So if you were to move here from another state with developmental delay, they would immediately say, we need to conduct an assessment and figure out which of the 13 are a better fit. And then I do have in the STAR, children 3 to 5 can be qualified under established medical disability. But again, that's just until age 5. So the next question the IEP team has to answer. So first they're asking, do they qualify? If the answer to that is yes, they can go on to the next question. Think of a flow chart. Does the disability that we've identified adversely affect the child's educational performance? So I want to emphasize, education isn't mean only academics. Education can mean lots of things. And Joe, we can go to the next slide, because this gives kind of a list of what we would consider academic and non-academic kind of skills. And so things like social emotional behavior status, health and development, hearing and vision. Like, it's not just, does my child know how to do arithmetic and write and read? It's broader than that. But how is the child performing? That's a current question. So we look at, how does the student perform today in a classroom setting? So things that the team sometimes has to kind of filter: how is the student doing at home? If the student is having, your child is having a very difficult time at home, but comes to school and is doing fine, that's a tricky question, because they can't say that the educational environment is currently impacted. They need to look at today. The IEP and the law is not designed to be proactive. It is designed, I would say, unfortunately, to be reactive. That we have to have a problem, we have to have an issue. I don't want to call it a problem, but we have to have something that needs attention now, not maybe soon. The other thing is, does the student already meet age expectations? There's lots of students that qualify for an IEP or have a disability that are also doing remarkably well in school. And so just because we have a disability does not mean that the student is necessarily impacted in the educational way. So I think we can go forward. So assuming that this question is also yes, we go to the third question. And that is specially designed instruction required? And so this is super complicated also, because we have to show that the student's needs can only be met with specially designed instruction. And so this can be that they need a specific level of training for the people working with a student. This can be that the student requires different kinds of instructional strategies, or a different curriculum, or an alternative setting, that the typical classroom is not the appropriate setting. So all of those things have to be considered. And if a student's disability can be accommodated within the classroom, and accommodation means we don't need to bring in services, we just need to maybe give extra time, or maybe have the student sit in the front row, or have the student be able to take a break, or have a device that assists the student in performing a particular action or activity. So in that case, that answer would be the student doesn't need that specially designed instruction, and therefore the student would not be eligible for an IEP. So as you can see, this is pretty technical, lots of like fancy vocabulary. And the next slide says, if the yes to all those questions, we're going to develop an IEP as a team. And again, I want to rehash, they cannot make, the school cannot meet and make this decision without you. You're part of the team that participates in the determination of eligibility. But if the questions asked, maybe some of them are yeses and some of them are nos, then the team can do different things. It's not like it was a big waste of time. I hate when families feel like this was, because you learn something about your child. You often have a conversation that might lead to the school offering something called a 504 plan, and that's where they offer, like I said, those accommodations only. Sometimes someone in that team will say, you know, I understand where the student needs some help, but we have a general education program that would provide that kind of help, and we wouldn't have to label a student unnecessarily as requiring special education. And then also sometimes there's outside resources that someone on the team will either research or refer a family to access. So I just like to kind of say that anytime you learn more about how your student learns and your students, you know, skills is really helpful. So we're going to presume the yes to all three questions, and we're going ahead and developing an IEP. And there are 4 kinds of IEPs. We've primarily been talking about that initial IEP, where we're really kind of wrapping our arms around who is this student, what are his or her individual needs, and, you know, kind of just meeting the student. But there are other kinds of IEPs. There's annuals, which you may hear referred to as a plan review. There are triennials, sometimes called eligibility reviews. And then there's something called a supplemental, or sometimes called an addendum. And that's when we have any one of those 3 and we need to adjust a portion, but we're not going to go through the whole IEP process. So we're going to reopen it to have like a limited discussion about a portion of the IEP. I'll keep going. So I want to talk about the cycles of the IEP. So we talked about that initial where you have 15 days, or the district has 15 days to give you an assessment report, and then you have some time to review the assessment plan, and then you have time to review the plan, and then the school has 60 days to conduct an assessment and provide you with the assessment report and discuss whether an IEP is appropriate. Once a student has an IEP in place, we have cycles. So at least every year, within 1 year from the original date, the team is going to gather together and they're going to, at minimum, review progress toward the goals and review that the placement is still appropriate. Minimum. So that's progress on the goals. Usually there's some tweaking or rewriting, or we're on to the next goal. Sometimes services are adjusted, and generally, you know, if things are going well, the placement continues. We're going to talk about placement later, but at least once a year that has to happen. Every 3 years from the date of the first initial, within 3 years, the student must be fully reassessed and the team must consider whether the student remains eligible. Again, those same 3 questions that we just talked about exhaustively, those will be reviewed. Does the student meet 1 or more categories? Does the student does that disability affect their educational performance? And then 3rd, is specially designed instruction still required? Every 3 years, at least. And then we talk about that supplemental. And what I want you to know about that is the 30 days from a parent request. Again, better to do that in writing or email, just saying. The school can also make that request. We want to open the IEP. Generally, that is because there's a goal that's either already been met and they want to suggest a different goal, or there's a goal for which there's no progress, or sometimes to talk about a behavior plan. Like, there's a variety of reasons, and they do need to communicate for what purpose are we having a supplemental meeting? Just like Joe and I recommend that if you're requesting the IEP meeting, you let the team know the kinds of things that you want to talk about so that the right people can be in attendance. And so that just like most families don't like surprises, the team doesn't like surprises either. So letting them know like, hey, we're not comfortable with how his toilet training is going, or we wanted to share some information we received from a medical evaluation, or we've changed, you know, it could be a variety of things, having a team meeting and making small changes to the IEP, or big changes. Those can be supplemental also. Okay. And so if there's only one thing you remember from this whole training, I hope you'll remember this slide. The IEP is developed using a sequential process. No matter what the timing or the reason for the IEP, the decision-making should reflect this process. And this is an evidence, data-driven kind of process. This is not high school debate team. This is not based on how well you argue. This is based on, did we have an appropriate assessment? Did that assessment identify all the areas of need and accurately describe the students' present levels of educational performance? Did we write appropriate goals that are ambitious and yet attainable? Have we described all the services needed for the student to derive educational benefit? And did we provide a placement that was the student's least restrictive environment? And that's what we're here to do. It is that, like, that flow. And one thing before Joe advances the slide is often families are quiet during the first portions. Either the assessment is very technical, they're not, you know, particularly confident of all the vocabulary, the areas of need are kind of often pre-written into the IEP, the goals, families are often reasonably intimidated because they're, again, pretty technical. Most of us aren't educators. And so it feels like it's kind of happening. And then we talk about how many minutes of speech therapy a student's going to get, and all of a sudden everyone wants to participate. And so as we go through this, this process, the next few slides, I do hope that you'll see that there are opportunities for your participation, and that participating early and often to make sure things that you're interested in are documented in the IEP is incredibly important. Okay, so looking at that assessment report, it is going to give you the areas of need and, again, those present levels of educational performance. That's a lot of words, so we're going to break that down. First, we're going to talk about areas of need. And if you recall back, I think it was like slide 34, when we had that list of all the things that mean educational performance. So it's not just academics, it's motor skills, it's all of it. Next slide, Joe, please. We're going to look at which of those did the student need to work on? Where are areas of improvement? Does the IEP and this team need to address that domain? And another way you could look at it as a family member is there an observable difference between the student, the way the student performs a skill, and that of their same-aged peer? So we're looking kind of, sometimes we look at discrepancy. Those are all ways that we're really defining this is a need. The student has this behavior, that's a behavioral need. The student cannot do this skill, that's a need. The student can do this skill, but not quite as well, not to the standard of other students, that's a need. And then we talk about present levels of educational performance. And so for each of these areas, so whether it's fine motor skills, whether it's gross motor skills, so fine being little and gross being like walking and balancing and doing big, large motor activity or large muscle group activities, the team is going to decide what the student is able to do and under what conditions they are able to do it. So when we're writing this present levels of performance, the emphasis is on what the student can do. And the team is really documenting kind of the baseline, the starting point from which we're going to measure progress. So this is a super good time for you to be able to put in what you see at home. If they're saying, oh, the student can't tie their shoe, that's the time to go, wait a minute, they can make the first knot and they know the bunny loops. It's just from that point on, like, so that you're establishing, wait a minute, that baseline needs to be accurate. Otherwise, we're going to start back here when we should be starting here. And we might write a goal that's too easy because we don't know where the student's starting at. So we want to participate. Sometimes it's identifying the area of need. We want to, again, if we think there's an area of need, we want to bring it up. We want to see whether, if it wasn't assessed as an area of need, is it because there wasn't an assessment done that said it was an area of need, or because an assessment was done and said no? So that's an important distinction that you can also bring up. Okay, so presuming that we've done the assessment and it's all fabulous, presuming that the assessment found these areas of need and everybody's in agreement, we move on to writing annual goals. We have best practices for writing goals on the next page. And sometimes you'll hear them called SMART goals. And you can read specific, measurable, ambitious, relevant, timely. But I want to spend some time talking about what goals should be. They should be understandable to an unfamiliar person, somebody who wasn't in that IEP when the goal was being written. It needs to be explained to you if you're in the room and you don't understand why the goal is important, or what the goal is intended to do, or what the next part of the goal would be, like, why are we doing this goal? And it should also represent priorities for the student. So I bring this up because some students or some families have a very strong desire that their student be educated in a general education environment. They want their child to have maximum contact with typically developing peers. And that is totally fine. However, if the bulk of the annual goals are all about the student's going to be able to do all these skills that require one-to-one instruction to teach, it's going to be very hard in half an hour of this meeting to make the case. So think through in advance, what's my final goal? And how am I going to structure my participation that keeps that goal in mind? So when I'm writing goals with an idea that I want this student to be in the general education classroom, my goals often have when paired with a peer, when given access to a general education environment, when, like, I embed the desired location often in the goal, or I'm writing goals that have to do with what my child's going to learn from being in general education. It's not like you have to pick one, but we have to be aware of what we're writing as goals and how it will affect some of the decisions coming down the pike. Next slide. So this is just a basic template. And again, this will be in your PowerPoint, and you can write goals. You can do it. And basically, it is literally just, what do I want to see? What positive skill? And then defining it. How often? Under what conditions? Under what conditions just means, like, when given access to this. So it could be when given a calculator that my child will be able to add a 2-digit number to another 2-digit number and, you know, compute the correct answer at least 80% of the time on 4 of 5 occasions as measured by tests. Like, that could be a goal. But it has to have those components. And again, it's my other, like, parent to parent tip is that we often say, as measured by teacher records. That's like 90% of goals I see, as measured by teacher records. And I just like parents to think about, can it be measured by teacher work? I mean, by student work samples or student portfolio? Can it be measured by data, behavioral data? Or could it be measured on an audio or video clip? For some of our motor skills that happen and then they're gone, those are really compelling pieces of evidence for the IEP team to look at later. So just kind of broadening and asking for, like, a little bit more accountability and goals is perfectly fine. A few more things. For each area of need, this is very basic, there needs to be at least one goal. If an area of need, let's take speech language. If your child has multiple needs within the area of speech language, then it is okay to have more than one goal, because as you're going to see, the goals, the number of goals, the complexity of the goal, the involvement of the student, those are going to help to determine how much service and support the student is given. So just one goal with a lot of stuff in it is not always as effective as having really well-crafted goals that address a variety of needs. So taking speech, I had a student that had an articulation issue, had expressive language disorder. That means speaking just in general was difficult. Receptive language disorder, meaning that they didn't understand as well as other kiddos. And also had pragmatic language issues, meaning how they related to their peers and used language to have these interactions was also a struggle. That's at least 4 goals, because those are very distinct areas of speech language, okay? If a student is taking the California alternate assessment, that means that the student is not taking the statewide testing that's offered to the vast majority of California students. Then goals must have either benchmarks or short-term objectives. And all that means is that when they write the annual goal, they break it down in advance so that there's clear measurements of whether a student is making progress, because we're not going to be able to take the statewide test and know that the student made tons of progress or not. And so we know we need to be providing that progress reporting in a much more obvious way. For all students that have an IEP, progress reporting does need to happen at least as often as report cards or progress reports are issued for their same age peers. And so I think we can go on to the next section, which is services, which is again where everybody lights up and says woohoo, because that's I think as family members we really can, that's something we can see and touch and track, whereas sometimes the rest of it feels like it's very educational and not so much about us. So when we look at services, the first one is often the primary service. It's often, unless a student is speech only or perhaps in a low incidence program, usually their primary service is called Specialized Academic Instruction, or SAI. This is really special education. It is delivered by an education specialist, another word for special education teacher, or by a paraeducator or paraprofessional. Those mean the same thing. And it should be discussed and defined in detail. And then we talk about related services. And this is a list, but it is not a menu, in that it's not all of the potential related services are on this piece of paper. These are a lot of pretty common ones, but whatever your child needs to make progress on his or her goals can be called a related service. And so you see that transportation is a related service. That's why it's paid for, is because it's allowing a student to access the educational environment and make progress on his or her unique goals. Parent training or counseling can be a related service. Again, speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, vision therapy, music therapy, like all of those are ones we've probably heard of, but just knowing that these are all out there already, but that anything that the IEP team determines that your child needs in order to progress can be seen as a related service. And now we're going to talk about how we describe those services. And so we look at things called frequency, duration, location, and intensity. I say in a minimum that the IEP should include. The intensity is only required under Part C, which is early start services, but it's definitely something that assists the team in writing a clear IEP. And so what this means is, by frequency, we mean how often will the student receive the service? Duration just means for how long. Intensity can be in a group of a certain size, or is it one-on-one? And then when we talk about location, it's not like we're going to say room 202 on this campus. That's not location. Location is generally inside of a general education setting or in a separate setting, which would mean students with general education are generally not there. Sometimes the team needs to specify more things, and so those are listed there on the right. And I'm going to give an example. Let's say a student is in general education for the majority of the day, and they need to receive speech language services in a pullout. The team's met, they've decided this. It's okay for you to say, hold on, I want to talk about when they're going to be pulled out of the classroom, because my child is already, has challenges in speech and language. I really want to just say this and have it be written into the IEP that he or she will not be removed from the general education class during core instruction for literacy. And that means when we're teaching reading, when we're teaching listening, when we're teaching writing, that student needs to be in general education, because otherwise we're missing something that we already know is a need to receive something else, which doesn't make sense, right? So that's the kind of thing that you can say, hey, while we're describing the services, I want to make sure we're not doing that. I want to make sure that, or if your student is most alert in the morning, but before 11, you could write in like math instruction for my child that's in high school. We need his math scheduled periods 1, 2, 3. Like after that, it's going to be less effective. So those are the kinds of scheduling, describing services that you can request be entered into the IEP document. Okay, now we're on something called placement. And how do I want to explain placement? Placement is, again, just like I said, not a room number. Placement is defined by who is present and what kinds of supports are already embedded in that place, in that location. But often districts get to decide the location of the services, but the team decides the placement itself. So they could have a placement at multiple different schools, and then the district itself would get to say which of those schools your child might attend. Does that make sense? I hope it does. I see chatting. So we're going to review least restrictive environment one more time. And again, it's to what extent a student is accessing general education standards. So Common Core state standards for most of us, right? And then to what extent is the student learning alongside his or her same-aged non-disabled peers? And the LRE is going to be different for every student because it's going to be driven by those IEP goals that are specific to that student. Just to talk about like kind of that basic idea. I don't remember. Let's talk about trade-offs. Let's talk about trade-offs, shall we? When we decide where a student is, just like when we were just talking a couple slides ago about my child has a speech language need. My child desperately needs to have speech therapy, but there's a trade-off when my child's out of the classroom, out of general education, my child's missing key instruction. So we make all these little decisions as an IEP team. And sometimes we need to say, hey, what is the student giving up? There's now a required component of an IEP that really identifies what is the harm from the intervention. So what's the harm of being in general education? The harm of being in general education, if you can call it harm, is what a student might be otherwise able to learn in a smaller, controlled setting with more supports and services. Conversely, what's the harm of being in a separate setting? The harm of being in a separate setting is all the social, language, behavioral modeling that students that do not have disabilities naturally provide, and access to topics, sources of knowledge, ways of thinking that might not be available in a separate setting. The other thing that it's important to distinguish is that we have general education teachers, and they are the subject matter expert for their particular, particularly when you get into secondary, so middle school and high school, they have the subject matter expertise. They know the math curriculum backwards, forwards. They know how to teach math. Special educators know how to teach, how to adapt. They know how to, use different strategies. They know how to work with particular disabilities. So together, sometimes so we're constantly balancing what's the student's biggest need, or we're going to give up a little of this in order to get this. But there's always trade-offs. And I want to just take a second while we have this slide up to talk about why we care about being with non-disabled peers. And so, like on a historical level, we should care because of segregation, right? We care about diversity and inclusion in all of its forms, including that people with disabilities are a natural part of the human experience. Pragmatically, I talked about like those pro-social, pro-language modeling and how important that is. And that's when I like to say, like, a speech therapist can teach a child how to play, but not how to play like a child, because they are playing like a professional adult who teaches play skills. And so it is different. And it doesn't make it bad. It doesn't make it wrong. It doesn't make it anything other than just that we go into it as parents with our eyes open. But long-term, having our goal when a child exits an education setting is that they're going to be ready for the community. They're going to be ready for whatever post-secondary education and training looks like. They're going to be ready to live independently. They're going to be ready for some sort of competitive integrated employment. Maybe not full-time, maybe not even part-time, but that they will be prepared to make meaningful contributions to their community and be a full, vibrant participant in that community. And so that's why I care about students having access. Okay, the next slide is really going to kind of set the stage for what a continuum of program options is. And that is, I'm looking at my time, we're right on track. The continuum of program options really builds from the bottom up. And when we look at that bottom layer of the pyramid that you see on your screen, that is general education without accommodation, pure general ed. That next one up, accommodations, we're really thinking of students with 504 plans. And we can go to the next slide, Joe. So 504 plan, which I talked about way back, and that's a student that has a disability that might need minor adjustments to the setting or to the instructional material, but fundamentally can access and make progress without specific services. When we go up to that third tier, we're talking about services and supports that occur in the comprehensive campus and inside of general education. So a student might have SAI services, so specialized academic instruction. So they might have someone come into their classroom and support them while they're doing a writing assignment. They might have an occupational therapist come in and work on their handwriting when the class is working on handwriting. Those are examples of what we would call push-in services. Most students will have a combination of both. And so for portions of the day, a student, even when they're hanging out most of the time in that third band, general ed, general campus, sometimes they'll spend a portion of their day in a separate setting, but on a comprehensive campus. And so that's really resource room. Maybe they're going into another classroom for a portion of the day to receive small group instruction with other students that have IEPs. That's fine. But a separate setting on a comprehensive campus could also mean a different kind of program. Each school district or school grouping has various programs called various things, but at the end of the day, the question is, where are the kiddos that are not disabled? Are they down the hall or are they down the street? That's really to me, that kind of differentiation. So then at the very top of our pyramid, we have something called separate setting located in a restrictive setting. And I would say separate setting located on a separate campus or separate site. And so that includes a lot of a variety of kinds of placements. And I'm going to read them. That includes home hospital. It includes non-public schools, which is a whole training of itself, residential treatment centers, and no surprise, virtual and remote learning also goes up there because of the absence of peers. So, and would also include something called independent study, homeschooling, whatever you want to call it. So when we think about the continuum, when we kind of have that, remember that legal preference is to kind of start in general ed and have to have rationales for why we're not in general ed, but that this presents, there are students for whom their least restrictive setting, least restrictive environment is the top of this pyramid, because that's the only unique combination of services and supports which allows them to make progress on their unique goals. So my kids' unique supports or my kids' unique goals might be able to be served in a couple different places. And so the team will be considering which of those places, but just the most important piece of this is to know that generally speaking, we're hoping that we're lower down, but that a child's LRE is that child's LRE. And for some students, it will be somewhere else. Okay, next slide. I think actually skip that one, please, Joe, because I rambled on a previous slide. And so we're at other elements of the IEP. If I had 6 hours, I could go through all of these. We have trainings on individualized transition planning, and that's really for students that are probably around 14 years old and up. So put that in the back of your brain for later. We could talk about extended school year. We could talk about participation in state testing, transportation, accommodations and modifications could be its own training, low incidence, that means usually visually impaired or deaf and hard of hearing. We also have assistive technology, behavior intervention plans, English language learners, considerations for those students, and supports to staff. Those are all things that need to go into this IEP. So you can imagine why an IEP takes a while, particularly if a parent is actually participating verbally. But we want to go to designing the IEP. And what I want to start with, we're going to stay on this slide for 1 second, Joe, is if everybody can just close their eyes, I'm going to close my eyes. Up until this point, we have worked together as a team to create an IEP for a student. Then there is this magical part, nobody says anything, but it happens, and parents are often confused. And the team will suddenly not include you because they will say, we're making an offer of a free appropriate public education. It is the district's job to make an offer. In fact, it is the administrator's job to make the offer on behalf of the school to you, the parent, who then have choices to make. So you're a member of the team up until the FAPE offer is made, at which point you get to decide whether to accept the FAPE offer. So let's go to the next slide. Skip that one. Thank you, Joe. I meant to hide some of these. So when we're agreeing to the offer of a free appropriate public education, you have choices. And I'm actually going to say, Joe, can we just go to the resources slide? Because I'm going to talk through them, but I don't think it's necessarily helpful to see that slide. Nope, back one. It's like I talk, it happens, it's magic. So when we think about how to respond to an offer, the one thing I hope that families listening will know is that it is not all or nothing. You can, and schools would be delighted if you will accept the offer of FAPE as written, that you'll sign agreement. Yay, that's great. But if you are not in agreement, you do not help anyone by signing that you're in agreement, because there will inevitably be friction. So it's helpful, sign if you're in agreement. If you're happy with the plan, yay, but read it first. If there are any portions of that, of the education program that you are really caring about, like that you're like, I don't see it, I don't know where it is, I don't know the words, ask before you sign. Like, I thought we talked about, aid support in math, and I'm not finding it in this 40 pages. Can you point it out to me? And then they can either point it out, or they're like, oh no, we didn't say we were going to do that. And then you'll have your answer. So if it's not a whole yes, you do have the opportunity to accept the IEP or to consent to the IEP in portions. You can pick the parts that you agree with and ask that those be implemented. And you can dissent or disagree or withhold consent to portions that you don't agree with. You do this generally, the easiest way to do this is to write a letter, or to write clearly next to your signature the portions that you're agreeing to. If you do nothing, just don't sign the IEP. If this is your initial IEP, nothing will happen. The school district cannot make you, they can't do anything to make you sign. So until you give some consent, until you say, yes, my child's eligible, yes, I want my child to have these services, or I agree to the goals, but I don't agree to the services, or I agree to this, but I don't agree to this, they really cannot implement. So that's true of an initial. From that point on, once you've signed any IEP, that IEP remains. It does not expire until you update it and sign consent for other things to be implemented. So that's the other piece, is like, you've gone to all this work, we have portions you like, don't you want to put them in place? School district cannot start to give services until it has your consent. So that's yet another kind of motivation to consider what I would call partial consent, or consenting to portions. And so you can clarify, if there's only like 2 things you don't like, I consent with the exception of this and this, or I do not consent with the exception of. Like, if all I'm happy with is the speech services, I can say, I accept the speech services, agree with the speech goals, blah, 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 but I don't agree to these other portions. In that case, a student, like the old IEP, will stay in force, accepting those other pieces. It's not clean, it's not pretty, but at least the student, we're making progress. And often what will happen is the district or the school will come back to you and say, let's come back together. We want to better understand the areas of dissent. Is there more information that you need? Is there something that we didn't write that you were expecting to see? Like, you can have a conversation. No matter what, the only time that it's like super conflict is if it's a IEP and you're saying, I don't consent. Everything else, mostly Joe and I see teams trying to work together. It is a process. I mean, I don't want to make it sound easier or more difficult. But it is, I wanted to identify that there is a part where the team breaks into 2 and you have the decision, but the team gets to write what they believe is an offer of a free, appropriate public education. So that's often a time that Joe and I can be of great help, is helping families kind of read through the IEP, understand what they're agreeing to, maybe understand where, like, we can look at it and say, we're not seeing what you're telling us you thought they agreed to. You might want to go back to the team and clarify before you sign. I want to just quickly scroll through the resources. And these are some resources that we very much recommend, and that is, we have future training calendars. We have a YouTube channel that has some of our own stuff, and then some things that we've collaborated with other agencies to develop. And then we are also on Instagram, as well as Facebook. Right now, Facebook's probably the more updated version, but we're working on it. And then you can always email Joe. Joe's email is there. And again, he is bilingual, Spanish and English. And then if you want to follow up with me, if you write me in Spanish, it will go back to Joe. So anyway, that is how to reach us. The next slide, I think, has some other resources that we really greatly recommend. One of them is the quality assurance from the California Department of Education. And this is a Q&A version of the Notice of Procedural Safeguards. And then that top is probably our favorite, and that is the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities publication that was put together by Disability Rights California. The nifty thing about it is, unlike so many things on the internet, it is for California. It is about special education in California, and so it consolidates federal and state code into one question and answer, super searchable and really pretty accessible reading. And it's available in a few different languages also, so we really like that. Next. And I think we're going to turn off the recording. We're so glad that you could join us, and we're going to go into question and answer.